Hey guys, welcome to an episode of InRange. This is the April 2023 Q&A, although you might be seeing it the first week of May. March, April, May. So we're recording it this week and then it'll probably be coming out next week just because timing and editing and etc. But this week we have guests on board and it's always a better Q&A when we do that. We got Ahmad and Garrett from Lead and Steel. And they are a manufacturer that one of the things they specialize in is optics. So we're going to get really deep and nerdy on optics, red dots, LPVOs, all that stuff today. But guys, would you like to introduce yourself and tell the audience about your company and what you're about?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start off by saying that I'm Ahmad. I'm the CEO of Lead and Steel. And go ahead, Garrett.
I'm Garrett. My title changes every day. So I'm just kind of here to do whatever he doesn't want to do.
Yeah, pretty much it.
Cool. So one of the things that got us on the radar and working together on this is actually Fagan at Midnight Brutality used your Prometheus optic on his rifle for shooting the match, and it worked really well for him. And before we get into the questions, and this isn't a pitch, I'm asking for this. You want to tell the audience about that? It's kind of your flagship optic right now. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I'd love to. So our Promethean LP1.
I'm sorry, Promethean. I said Prometheus.
You're fine. You're okay.
Yeah.
Our LP1 is our flagship red dot. We came to market with this after about 2 years of R&D. Just a little bit of context and background for the company. I started Lead and Steel about 4 years ago, right around the time that I started law school, which is a terrible idea. And if anyone is trying to balance business and grad school, don't do that. But thankfully, we started off just basic like resale, third-party resale, just to kind of like self-fund everything. And when we had enough money, we put it together to make a really cool optic here because most of the revenue that we generated was optics resale. So we kind of saw what optics manufacturers were doing right and what they were doing wrong. And so we figured the first product that we should launch shouldn't be anything particularly revolutionary or reinventing the wheel. It should just kind of be ticking all the right boxes. And so I think we succeeded with, the LP1. The main design requirements for us were durability and reliability in austere and adverse conditions. We wanted a red dot that could handle considerable, I should say, impact abuse and kinetic energy. And so we did that with the LP1, thankfully. Just a little bit of background. My brother, who helped us with much of the design, is a mechanical engineer. He currently works for GM in the auto design department. And so he helped, with some of his homework, a lot of the theoretical stuff on this, mainly the finite element analysis, and then obviously the prototype testing. And so we went through several revisions to kind of get the formula right, if you will. And so, because of that, things like that, thankfully, we have a lot of talent on the team. Garrett has a huge, extensive sales background. My business partner, Kamal, also an attorney. And his specialties particularly is intellectual property. So we kind of get that wheelhouse as well. And mine, from the corporate M&A side, thankfully. And so, we have a good amount of wind, thankfully, behind the LP1. And that's part of the reason why we've had such a mental and successful launch. We launched in October of last year. We sold out in 60 seconds. And thankfully, the response by the community has been nothing short of absolutely wonderful. And, entirely thankful for that. And so, it's the extended R&D period was definitely worth it. It allowed us to really fine tune as much of the theory as possible. So we didn't have any, design changes that we had to make kind of on the fly with iterative manufacturing. And this is the end result. It is an extremely large window, red dot sight that LED powered. So nothing really particularly crazy from that perspective. We just use, really good components. We get our emitters out of Japan as well as our glass. And we do a lot of the assembly in-house, QC and QA as well. And so we kind of maintain a pretty good idea of what we want out of the optical system and what its limitations are. And thankfully, we did all of that using material science and design ideas, and we're hitting at an awesome price point. People are seeing that and believing it. So, going back and forth, I was talking to Garrett about like our initial pricing and the pricing that we offer the LP1 at. And we realized that buyer psychology very much is tied to pricing. And so my idea was, hey, we're just going to offer this thing at an excellent price point and have durability characteristics that exceed the industry standard. So it's like a no-brainer for people. And what we ended up having is just people started, comparing us to some of the cheaper brands. And it's like, no, that's not who we are. That's not the product that we're bringing. Right. But thankfully, with a little bit of, marketing effort, we're trying to, undo a little bit of that. So that's it. That's the LP1. This thankfully brought in a decent amount of revenue for us to do R&D on a couple of other projects. It kind of opened the floodgates, if you will, to work on several projects in the optics world, several small arms projects, and then thankfully some cool nylon that we have coming around the corner. So we'll see how it goes, man. But
I know we've had good success with the LP1, like at Midnight Brutality, ran through that whole thing like a champ, and I know Fagan's been using it extensively in other competitive environments and had great success with it. So that speaks to a lot. So when you say like at a lower price, what is the market on the LP1 currently?
Street price right now is about $350 to $375, depending on configuration. We also have some added accessories that we're bringing in here soon. The hood is user serviceable and replaceable. And so, we're coming to market with some replacement hoods at like $30, $35, different, anodized colors and Cerakote options and customizability there. So, trying to really, make it easy for people to get into an affordable optic without having to make, compromises to durability and glass clarity and battery life and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. That's a crowded market, right? To come to the market with a red dot sighting system, there's a lot of stuff out there from I don't know if this is the bottom, but when I think of the bottom, I think of like NC Star, right? Yeah. And then you go up to a bunch of extremely expensive American-made products, some of which we reviewed on the channel and frankly had really bad results with. I'm not going to go there right now, but some of the expensive ones really didn't perform. And so it isn't a direct equation to cost to quality and value. And I think that's what you're trying to do here, is prove that you can do that and make a quality product that isn't, exorbitantly expensive, but still presents and functions very well.
Correct. Yeah.
So fair. So we got a bunch of questions and we're going to nerd out on this a little bit. And I appreciate you guys taking time out for this. Yeah. And we have never done one like deep dive on optics. So some of these questions I legitimately were really intrigued by myself. In fact, some of them, when I read them, I'm like, I don't know. I don't have a clue. So that'll be kind of fun. Let's go ahead and start with the first one from RGB. The new microprism sights are smaller and lighter than I've ever thought possible for a magnified optic. Is there a theoretical lower boundary for how small an optic of a given magnification can be? So essentially, what's the size limitation for greater magnification? Usually when you think of, optics that are greater magnification, they tend to be bigger, right? So this is a equation. What's the balance there?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's also relevant. We're ironically developing a little Prism line. It's called our Hyperion line or Hype line that we'll be bringing here soon. But, microprisms in general, I should start off by saying that magnification in general is not something that is easy to shrink down, right? Physics and manufacturing capability are going to be like your biggest constraints. Generally speaking, magnification is just it's the divided ratio of your focal length of your objective lens by your ocular lens. So like the length of which your objective lens collects light and, refracts light to the focal point divided by the same on the other side, basically with the ocular lens. And so if you have like let's say, 10 centimeter, or rather 1,000 millimeter focal length for your objective, and then your ocular, the one that sits next to your eye, is let's say, 20 millimeters, then you have a 50x magnification. Right. And that level of curvature of the optic is what, brings that collection of light into the focal point or focal plane. And so there's only really so much that you can do in terms of glass size while still allowing for a long enough focal length where you can, use an ocular lens that's going to give you that multiplication factor that you're looking for. And so, really, yes, I think about what we have right now in terms of the market with like some of the 1x micro prisms and 3x and 2x and whatever. That's about as, reasonably as small as the industry can go. Are there other industries that have, excellent glass forming techniques? Yes, the medical industry is one of the big ones that comes to mind. The problem is that, you can't put that tech into firearms and expect durability and reliability. And obviously it's very expensive and it's hard to do at scale. And so, kind of what you see right now with the optics game, particularly the Prism space, it's just kind of like a master of none in terms of whichever optic you want. And if you want something more specialized, that obviously has to be for a particular use. And so, for the use cases that we're coming out with, we're bringing a 1x micro prism. Really, we're just doing it as like a red dot replacement for guys with astigmatism. But like our Hype 4, that's an ACOG competitor. That's not a mini micro prism. That's something with a large field of view, long, eye relief, very healthy eye box, still relatively lightweight, forward mounted optics, that sort of stuff. But it's not going to be this little itty bitty thing, because we see a lot of that in the market already, and some people want more than that. And it really is just trade-off after trade-off. So realistically, the market has what you're looking for. It's just a matter of, the compromises that you're willing to make to get there. But it's a good question. It's just, I wish we could go smaller. We just not right now.
Well, like the laws of physics apply to a degree is what we're talking about here. Like, so for example, also the ability to deal and be resilient with the kind of recoil and such that'll be put into an optic while it's on a rifle. So when I think about it, like, for example, an iPhone, right? This thing has this little bump on it. And the reason they have the bump on it is because they wanted to get a 3x optical zoom versus digital zoom because they needed more focal length, right? But that thing is an iPhone that's in my pocket. It's not going to handle the recoil of a 308 rifle. And that's the challenge I think you're implying there. That's the problem. And that's what limits the size, really.
Yeah, certainly. And it's not just like your glass panes that also limit the size. It's not just your ocular and your objective. Like, if it's like a fixed prism, you're usually dealing with manipulating a virtual image, and that uses something called a Pechin prism, and people can kind of Google that if they want to see what that is. But what you're doing is you're taking the virtual image that comes through the objective lens as it becomes flipped, and you're flipping it back to the what you see in the ocular, and so that requires its own hardware. Plus, the internal tube that your windage and elevation sets on to move the prism around so that you can zero your optic. Like, all of these things, when you shrink one component down, by necessity you will need to shrink several others down, and as a result, how much money do you have for tooling to do all that stuff? It's hard to do. I think what we have right now is going to be what we have for the short while, I guess.
Fair enough. Second question, Eamon B. This is more of a subjective one, quite honestly. Do you think that handguns without optics have become obsolescent? By the way, people love this word obsolescent because on InRange we've had this discussion about bolt action rifles being obsolescent, etc. Doesn't mean they're not still a weapon. Doesn't mean you still can't shoot something with it. But by modern standards, it's like, you bring a bolt action to an AR-15 competition, you got a challenge, right? So I'm going to go with this as a competitive shooter, as what the brutality match is. I think that having a handgun without an optic at this point, you're legitimately hindering yourself. A red dot on a pistol provides you not necessarily more speed, but it provides you more precision and accuracy than you would when you're having to focus on a physical front sight and superimpose it on a sight picture of a target you want to shoot. With a red dot, you have a heads-up display, you have better situational awareness. The dot, as long as your eyes are functioning properly, is just this clear thing in front of you, between you and the target, and you don't have to deal with multiple layers of things before you have a sight. You have a focus on a front sight and therefore are accurate, as well as a front sight tends to be more chunky and bulkier than, of course, a dot would be. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to allot some time for Garrett to talk about this too, because the guy spends a lot of time.
Yeah, he's going to cover what he just did.
Yeah, I don't want to get too in the weeds.
I'm obviously not the technical person, but if we talk about shooting use cases stuff, that's a little bit more my speed than talking about focal planes and things like that. So I'll take this one first.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit of both feet on each side. For my carry guns, I do optics and I do irons. It really just depends on, first of all, what the gun is. Second of all, what my use case is expected to be. Like you said, for competition use without an optic, you're at a disadvantage. It adds a ton of speed. That being said, I'm still a little bit of a traditionalist. I like my bolt actions. I like irons. I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. But it's a matter of, especially now with carry guns, we're getting, especially with people milling them in the cuts, you're still getting your co-witness through it. So it's not something that I'd be comfortable to say, don't spend any time on irons. It's irrelevant at this point. But it really comes down to, what are you willing to put time into? Regardless of if it's a dot or if it's irons, nothing's going to beat actual trigger time with it. So, it's kind of a cop-out, but it's a personal question.
Yeah.
Like I said, I do both. So Ahmad's probably going to come in and say, no, here's the right answer.
Yeah. I mean, no one knows, but here's the right answer.
Yeah.
For me, I guess it depends. For my use cases, if it's like self-defense, I despise open emitter red dots. I would rather iron sights than an open emitter dot, and I would rather a closed emitter dot than iron sights. That's just kind of how I have my little, I guess, continuum there.
This is where we disagree.
But... Yeah. Like for me, yes, it's good to trade irons. I think that's certainly, something that's, within the wheelhouse of any trained proficient shooter. But at the same time, especially when you start getting to smaller carry guns, sight radius does play an important factor in your irons and your effectiveness as, someone who can use and deploy the weapon effectively. And when you have a red dot, you eliminate many of those variables, right? I don't have the best eyesight, right? I'm not going to notice the slightest of movements of my front sight on a 3-inch carry gun, right? I will notice it on a red dot though. And so that's what, keeps me in line and check as a shooter. Do I want to be digging out dust and crap out of my, open emitter dot before I deploy the weapon? No, absolutely not. So again, that's why I prefer the irons. But for a closed emitter system, I think that's probably the best that you're going to get. And to cover as many bases as possible, especially how lightweight these things are. They don't play with slide reciprocation all that much. And so, if I can have it, I'd use it. But, red dots, realistically are a relative recent, adoption in terms of carry guns and stuff like that. People have been using them just fine with irons. And I'm sure, any proficient shooter can fall back to that worst case, but that's where I stand on.
Yeah, I by no means would say that irons are useless by any stretch of the imagination. We've done a lot of great work with iron-sighted firearms for a long time in history here, and that'll continue to be the case for a long time. And like you said, the size of the gun and what it's designed for and what the intended purposes dictate that. A little belly gun like a P32 from Keltec, you're not going to need an optic on that. You're not even going to try to shoot that past probably a yard or two at most. So that's a different problem. But at the same time, some of these mid-sized little carry guns we're seeing now, where you can put a red dot on it, you do mitigate and kind of deal with and correct the issue of the shorter sight radius you brought up. By having the red dot, you don't have to worry about that anymore. It no longer becomes really relevant. And in fact, at Handgun Brutality, just a couple weeks ago, Fagan again shot twice, and he shot with one of these little carry pistols with a red dot on it, and his performance with a carry pistol, a pocket gun, wasn't that far off from his service weapon because it had a dot. If he had shot that with irons, it would have been a much more challenging course of fire, just because you can't really take the same precision that you could as a result. So obsolescence, a weird word. I don't know that I'd say that. And I think that irons on pistols, this is a controversial statement, are still more relevant than they are on rifles. But that's another topic. We'll go to the next one. We'll just leave that one hanging out there. Chris G, what setup do you guys find yourselves gravitating towards in regards to the never-ending Prism versus LPVO versus red dot and magnifier debate? Once again, this goes across the board. It really is subjective, but between you guys, what's your preferences? And maybe the preferences are based on what you're doing too.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly use case dependent. I'm going to keep giving you guys this cop out. I'm sorry about that, but use case dependency is probably the biggest thing for me. If I have to fall back to the traditional self-defense dual rifle use case, I'm going to run a red dot. It's adequate enough for me to engage targets at 200 yards. Is it enough for me to do proper PID? No, absolutely not. And so a clip-on magnifier works great. I can keep it in a pack. I can keep it on my kit. If I ever needed it, you can clip it right on. I think that for me, that's a pretty good compromise in between. If you're looking at a distance roll, obviously you want to add some mag behind that. And so the whole LPVO thing definitely makes sense. One of the things that we're working on now that, we'll have some more details on here sooner is should we talk about it? Yeah, we'll talk.
Just tease it.
Okay. So we're working on an LCAN competitor, a 1-4, and it's going to kick Raytheon right in the dick. Pardon my French. And so
the promise of the LCAN is real. The delivery is where it falls short, right? That's the problem. The idea is amazing. Doing it better would be cool.
Yeah, 100%. And so bringing that into the fold of the 21st century is ideal. Being able to have that sort of capability where you have near red dot capability with almost unlimited eye relief, and then obviously with the flip of the switch having 4 power, which is more than enough for most applications, is also ideal given the nature of the trade-off of the weight. If you can keep it under LPVO range, you're good to go in terms of durability and stuff. And so, if I had, I guess it depends on barrel length and capability. If it was anything under, say, 13 inches of barrel length and 5.56, I would probably prefer a red dot. And past that, I would like to add some magnification. And if I could get away with it, I'd put the weight somewhere else, not on the gun. But that's where I'm at with it. But go ahead, Garrett.
So I'm kind of on the opposite side. To me, I'm an LPVO fan. And to me, a good one is going to give you a crisp 1X. You're not really going to lose much as long as you know what you're looking for and you're willing to kind of jump in with both feet into that market. You're looking at about 20 ounces for a good LPVO with a clear 1X. You're looking at about the same to get a beefy red dot with a magnifier, which limits you to your 1X and your 3X. You're taking up the same amount of rail space, and then you're adding more snag points to it. So for me, most of my shooting is 200 yards and in. I'll stretch out a little bit more. And honestly, I don't really find myself, cranking an LPVO past 3 or 4 most of the time anyway. But knowing it's there just for identification, just to kind of see what's going on, knowing that peace of mind, if I need a little bit more precision at distance, I have it with just, a simple twist and for the same motion, more or less, as a magnifier. That being said, I run LPVOs on 12.5s. I do have a couple magnifiers, but I find myself, just keeping them on the gun because I have them. But if I'm taking them out and I'm shooting, they end up coming off because they're just not really worth the weight for me. Again, it's entirely a subjective question. I'm sure you may fall somewhere in between us. If there's a use case for it, you just have to know what your use is going to be. But for me, if I want a do-it-all one optic on a rifle, I want magnification.
Yeah, this is one of the things where, as much as I'm a proponent and really do love competition, especially our brutality matches for like practice, right? One of the things that you can take away as a inappropriate lesson, although not wrong, depending as long as you put it in the context, is that an optic without any form of eye relief, i.e. a red dot, is the fastest possible thing. You can get behind it in the most awkward positions, under cars, through barricades, acquire it like that. That is the fastest possible sighting system. But fastest possible sighting system doesn't necessarily mean the right thing. For example, in a really truly tactical environment, or where there's extended ranges, an LPVO does a more important thing, which is allow you to identify what the hell it is you're looking at. So you can't do that with a red dot that is just a naked red dot. And so it is, again, use case based on what you need to do. For myself personally, I really do prefer red dots for that lack of eye relief, but I'm also not concerned, at least not with what I'm doing with my rifles, for target identification, because for the most part, I'm at a match shooting at steel, right? So I'm not worried about, is that an acceptable thing to shoot at, because it's a range designed for that purpose. But if I was out in the field, hiking across wherever land, and I needed to be able to identify and figure out what's going on, I think an LPVO brings that more to the table. Just like I think we're falling into the same plate, right? For prisms, I think prisms are fine for people who have, as you said, stigmatisms. Personally, I will tend to go with a red dot because prisms still have some level of eye relief, while a red dot has none. And I prefer that. But that doesn't mean a prism doesn't have its purpose. They're very clear, very crisp. They can do things in that regard. But we'll get more into that later. But it sounds like I'm kind of in the middle of both of you on that one. But again, it's about use. And so if you had one rifle, because if you could only take one gun and you needed it to do everything, the LPVO will win, frankly. All right, next question. This one's definitely more for you guys. Robin V, what is the next big leap in optics technology? Thermal overlays, target identification? Question mark. Like, what do you see as the future here?
Yeah, anything that makes shooting at distance a cheat code, I think. So, thermals, IR, auto calibrating BDC, things that adjust for caliber, barrel length, elevation, windage, with built-in rangefinder, that sort of stuff. If anyone viewing is familiar with the new Vortex optic that was recently awarded a contract, that's probably kind of in line with where it would go. As much cross-contamination between software and your weapon system as possible. I think that's where it's going to go. And so, the big thing being probably all, auto calibrating ballistic drop. I think that would probably be the biggest thing. We're working on some tech that we can get into later, that, you know, can implement some of that stuff in, but that's where I would take it if I had to, I guess, you know, spin the magic 8 ball, if you will.
There's been efforts to pick up. I also think it's going to be auto calibrating, you know, BDCs. That's really, you know, ammo's not cheap. People want to make sure they hit the first time. So that's, to me, really going to be the focus. There's been attempts in the past of, you know, Bluetooth connecting a rangefinder to a scope, you know, inputting grain weight, distance, elevation, and trying to find, you know, kind of like in a video game, how it will show you that hit point of where you're aiming. Obviously wasn't perfected, especially if you're introducing, you know, Bluetooth communication to a third-party device that you then have to whip out, you know, separately from your rifle. You know, I think that probably entered the market a little bit too soon, but at the same time, it was a good proof source to kind of see, you know, how is this received? What can be improved upon? And, you know, really, how can we kind of get it into a self-contained unit? And then you're going to enter into the conversation of, okay, now you have a 4-pound optic on your rifle because it's essentially a computer. And then you're talking about battery life, you're talking about reliability. You know, it's definitely, we're not quite there yet, but again, over like, you know, thermal imaging or something like that, I think it's going to be a BDC that adapts to what you want it to. Personally, that's what I like to see, and that's kind of what the focus is.
Yeah,
it's interesting when you said, "Do you guys ever fire the tracking point?" When that was the hot thing for a moment. Do you remember the tracking point rifle? Yeah, so that was what that was attempting to do, right? You would laze the target, it would determine the distance, then it would give you a firing solution, and then you would press the trigger and then move 2 crosshairs over each other, and then when they connected, the gun would go off. It was very disconcerting because the gun fired itself, right? So you're so used to making, like, it almost feels like you're having an ND, although you weren't, because you're intentionally making these crosshairs line up with one another. But what that of course couldn't deal with windage, because you don't, the computer couldn't read wind conditions by lasing a target, but it could determine distance. Interesting question in that regard. But when it comes to an automatic calibrating BDC, tell me where I'm off on this or if I'm on point. There's only really 2 ways you can do that. You have to either laze the target, 3. Laze the target, know the distance to the target somehow to enter it, or have a computer that knows the size of the thing you're aiming at and determine the distance based on its essential perspective within the field of view, right? So if a human is 6 feet tall and it looks like this, it's this many pixels, we know the distance based on how many pixels it is in my sensor, right? That would be one way, but that's going to require knowing the size of what you're aiming at and having a pretty advanced computer doing that kind of like math. Yep. Otherwise, you're left with only lasing, right? And that means you have to have a good laser that can actually do a good read.
Yeah.
So I'll start because he might get a little more technical than I do. But yeah, that's exactly the issue. And that's kind of what we've seen come to market already of, okay, this is what I want to hit. Let me enter in the distance. Let me enter in the ammo I'm using, give it a couple seconds to connect, and then adjust. You know, it's not something kind of on the fly where, you know, in the sci-fi world that I'd like to see happen, you've got your rangers already on the scope. You know, if you can hold it there and it can kind of sense, like you said, via pixels or whatever it may be, to say, okay, here it is, especially if it's moving, here's the speed it's moving at. And, you know, kind of within the next second, 2 seconds, something like that, show you where that hit point would be. To me, that's the ideal answer. Again, that's not something that we have the answer to right now that we're going to say, you know, coming soon, we figured this out. But at the same time, you know, that's where my focus would go in terms of how can we advance, you know, optic technology.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, from the near term, it's going to be lasing. That's going to be the main thing. The technology that we can't make it mass manufacturable and that small just yet to be able to do any calculations outside of that, at least from what I've seen. You know, some engineer could correct me in the comments. I could be wrong.
Oh, they absolutely will. Don't worry.
Yeah. Actually, I'm from Duke, and yeah.
It's interesting that the same challenge, it's funny because they're obviously not the same technological goals, but the same challenge would exist from a computer perspective of how they try to make autonomous vehicles in terms of perceiving the world around it, the distance to like a tree or a cone or a wall, and the lines on the road. And there's so many things that can mess that up, right? Like, so for example, a black piece of tape across a stop sign will prevent an autonomous vehicle from thinking it's a stop sign anymore. So the same kind of rules apply, even though the purpose, what you're trying to do here is fire or determine a ballistic solution.
Yep.
So
that's probably dabble in it, but I don't think, we could release something that just, it wouldn't be up to snuff. Yep. And it would really, like you said, you find one factor we didn't take into consideration, and then this thing is useless now, if you're wearing a green hat or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. So no, I think you're right. I think it's a really cool idea. At the same time, when I guess a competitor, but it's so weird to watch. HoloSun's been doing some crazy stuff, like that optic that they put out at SHOT Show. Yeah.
I mean, not to just downplay competition for the sake of downplaying competition, but
sure.
The technology for thermal optics has been here for a while, and it's not particularly difficult to hit a specific price point with some concessions that can be made. There is an allure to affordable thermal in night vision, but the question that you have to ask is, what exactly are you getting for your money, and how functional is that compared to the high dollar equivalents? Based on resolution, battery life, refresh rate, that sort of stuff. All of these things, all these factors come into play. And so, it's easy for an engineering firm to be like, hey, here's an optical design that can do X, Y, and Z for you at this price point. It's harder for the end user to be like, I need to see why exactly this should be worth my $1,000 versus the $3,000 that the next competitor costs. That's, basically all I can say about that. But yeah.
Yeah, no, reasonable.
You're going to send us one of those rifles to try, right? Is that where that was going?
A tracking point? I don't have one. I wish I did. Yeah, because I don't really like, I have to admit, I didn't care for the thing when I fired it. I fired it at SHOT Show and a couple of demonstrations. And like I said, it was an extremely odd experience for the gun to fire when it felt it was time to fire. That said, it did hit the targets. I mean, it did work.
But it's not firing on release. You pull the trigger, you match up the crosshairs.
Yeah, you're holding the trigger for the entire duration of the firing solution. And then the minute those lines line up, it goes off.
Okay.
It worked. It's just like very weird. Yeah. But again, I get why. I understand that design principle. Yeah, look it up sometime. It also had some vulnerabilities as well, because it's a computer and it could be like but that's a whole other topic. Yeah.
Always appreciate some innovation.
Of course. All right, Dodge This 27. As someone who recently searching for a red dot found out I have an astigmatism, is there any possibility of a prismatic sight for a pistol? So we're the rage now of red dot sighted pistols. Could you do a prism on a pistol? I've never seen anyone try.
Eye relief is extremely difficult to do at that distance.
Yeah. Because you're pushing out. You also have an inconsistent eye relief, right? So if you push out too far, you won't see it. You come in too close, you won't see it. There'll be a sweet spot, and that's why a red dot works, because there is no eye relief.
Yeah, look, the reason why I think a lot of companies aren't investing in that is because a red dot for handguns, even if you have astigmatism, okay, your 3 MOA dot is now a 6 MOA dot. Cool. At the very least, you can pick it up around a barrier. You can pick it up here. You can pick it up out here. Right? Like realistically, the 3 inches at 100 yards may not make the biggest difference if it's life or death, And so I think it's, I think we see more of the, trying to get the red dot as small as possible for, the compact carry guns versus, trying to put the microprisms on them. But it's a cool concept. Great idea. I wish it could be executed.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I've got a very bad astigmatism. And I carry a 3-inch carry gun. It's got a circle dot reticle on it. And to me, I've never spent enough time looking at the reticle to say, that center dot is blurry for what I want it to do. It's just kind of, 25 yards and in, I'm hitting what I want to hit. And I'm not, bullseye shooting with that. That being said, I've time behind SROs and things like that. You do notice it a little bit. But then it goes back into, the speed versus accuracy conversation of what are you doing with your pistol?
Yeah.
And under high stress, you'll probably not notice it nearly as much as you are when you're fixated on it at home.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a lot different in your basement to look at something and say, oh, this doesn't look perfect, as opposed to, emptying a magazine with it.
Totally. All right, this next question is the one that I was like, wow, I know all about testing optics for this and making sure they have the least of it, but I don't know how it's achieved. Teddy, what goes into reducing parallax in a modern red dot optic? That is such a good one because we all know what parallax is, right? The idea that when you move around and the dot moves within the sight picture of the glass, that it actually doesn't keep its zero, air quote, and the less parallax possible, the less the amount of parallax in the optic, the more you can shoot from the corners and the edge of the glass and still get a good hit. What is that? Because typically cheaper red dots have bad parallax and more expensive ones are better in this regard, but not always. But what do you do to reduce parallax? That's a great question.
Yeah. Parallax is near impossible to fully get rid of at close distances with any LED based red dot. Usually it's not enough to make a huge difference, but depending on the optical design, it could certainly shoot you off target at like 50 yards or something. The biggest thing is, what are you doing in your optical design to reduce the probability of someone coming off the optical axis? That's the biggest thing.
Mm-hmm.
Situating themselves, well enough within the window so that parallax is, relatively minimal. The biggest thing that we've seen is the distance between the emitter and the objective lens, right? Particularly when it comes to some of these really small closed emitter carry optics that we've been seeing recently that kind of like fit footprints that are already made. They're closed emitter, but like between the distance of the glass is like a very tiny amount. Parallax can be exacerbated in some of those optical systems. And so, it does behoove you to an extent to have further distance there so that, from the shooter's perspective, there isn't much movement of the reticle within the optical window that's still going to be, outside of the optical axis, because you're looking through the optic. And so you can see some of those changes. Whereas, if the glass is that much closer to the emitter and the ocular lens, you may not see them as much. And so your LED could be viewed from an extreme angle off the axis of the optic, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, that's the optical design is one of the biggest things. Obviously, things like, your glass, your objective lens is certainly a big thing. The quality of the grind and the polish and the anti-reflective coatings that are used, the consistency of the glass. Because when you fire an emitter at an objective lens, obviously some of that light refracts out. Much of it reflects in towards the shooter's eye. And so if you have inconsistencies in that manufacturing process, certainly parallax could be exacerbated just because of issues in the convex lens itself and the manufacturing process there. And so that could also throw off the point of impact. And so it's a healthy mix of all of those things. Realistically, quality red dots don't really exhibit that problem. Most of them don't. I know you did a little bit of testing yourself, like you said. And so I'd be curious to hear maybe after the Q&A what your results were with some of those guys. Yeah, those are probably the first few things that, off the top of my head, would consider.
So the quality of the glass, but interestingly, the distance from the emitter to the glass is just part of the actual design. So a larger optic, a larger red dot is likely to have less of an issue with parallax than a tiny one.
All else being equal in terms of the actual surface area of the glass between those two. Yeah. Yep.
Right. But if you made a large red dot with completely trash glass, it still might not matter. Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. I've never thought about how you did to reduce what was done to reduce that. That's very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
This is more of a practical one. Windwalker 57. If you're using scopes with impaired vision, should I always wear my glasses or remove my glasses and focus the scope accordingly?
So I assume they're playing with an adjustable diopter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So let's a prismatic or an LPVO, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So my recommendation would be focus the optic to your eyeballs without your glasses. Mark that on the optic body with like a Sharpie or something in the diopter. Bring it back, put your glasses on, shoot normally. If you don't have your glasses, you know exactly where to adjust it to have your prescription in line. That would be my recommendation. But
It's kind of the perfect answer. I don't have anything for that.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea because then you've solved both problems, right? You can't always guarantee your glasses are going to be with you, or maybe they fell off and broke. Reminds me of an old Twilight Zone episode. I'm going to go off topic for a minute. We always do this on the channel. It was an awesome episode. There was this guy that was a bookworm, and all he ever wanted to do was read his books, and his wife wouldn't let him give him time to read his books, and his job wouldn't let him read books. And he was working in the bank vault one day, and nuclear war happens, and he survives because he's in the bank vault. I mean, it's Twilight Zone, and he comes out and everything's a wasteland, and he's wandering through what's left, and he finds a library. He's excited because he's finally got time to read these books, and then he breaks his glasses. And that was the end of the episode, right? So what you've done is solve the problem regardless of if you've broken your glasses or not, as long as you know where to go with it. That makes sense. Cool. Ryan, how long until my glasses or goggles have a cool heads-up display reticle built in that I can sync to a firearm? I mean, Apple's working on an augmented reality glass right now, but this is expensive stuff. I think technically this is possible now. It's probably a cost problem.
Cost, mass manufacturing, and obviously the physics behind recoil absorption through an optical system. So, like, I mean, we can't, go into terrible detail on this, but we are in contract with a manufacturer that can implement real-time data into an optic system. Using an LED array in place of a traditional etched, reticle at the focal point. And that hypothetically could be paired to a smartphone, which could have that real-time data transmitted to said optic, right? And so that's just a hop away from like smart glasses, And so I can definitely see that. Again, more of that cross-contamination between software and hardware. Certainly a little more, feasible, I'd say. So I think we're pretty close. I think.
I bet you we're going to see this at a price that's viable for the consumer in the nearish future. What, next couple of years, maybe?
24 months.
Yeah, 2 years.
Well, if we nail all our details. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, it's interesting. It's like really science fiction coming to life, right?
Yeah.
So I'm using an optic. This is on topic. I'm using an Opsin digital night vision scope, which is what I used at Midnight Brutality, which is, of course, a very different approach to night vision, being a digital device. And there's like this tiniest little bit of lag and latency because of the computer having to do its work, which, by the way, I don't find it to be prohibitive at all. But that thing also has Wi-Fi. That device would theoretically, if you had some sort of something that could transmit from the gun, could get there already, right? They're like, that's already close. Interesting. All right, Alex, if using a red dot in combination with a magnifier on a QD mount, does removing the magnifier to use it as a monocular, like just to look at something, and then put it back on affect your zero? Shouldn't do anything, because really the zero is the red dot, not the magnifier. The magnifier is just magnifying what's in front of it.
Yeah, I've heard some people say some things on the internet about having to zero your magnifier. Yes, aligning the magnifier to the optic window.
Yeah, you center.
Yeah, of course. You want it centered, of course.
Sure.
Yeah.
So as long as your mount returns to zero and you're using a quality mount, that shouldn't be a problem.
I agree.
What you were talking about of keeping the magnifier separate.
Yeah.
Keeping it with you as a 3x ranger and having it when you need it. Shouldn't be any issue.
Yeah.
I've also heard people, and this isn't this question, but I've had people, who knows, with uncertainty and doubt and lore, should you zero with the magnifier on or with it off, and does it change the zero? My experience has been I tend to zero if I'm going to use a magnifier with the magnifier because it just makes it easier. Yep. But when you take the magnifier off, it doesn't change the zero. It just makes it easier to do.
Right.
All right, cool. So also, I got 2 questions from Utreon versus Patreon, 2 different support channels. We got Surgeon here. What are the challenges in designing and manufacturing optics that maintain a seal, thus preventing internal fogging under repeated shock from weapon firing? So how do you purge and seal these things so they don't fog, really just on the technical level?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can speak kind of like generally on optics assembly. Some of the cheaper, we call them like Amazon pop-up optic brands, right? You see issues with purging. That's probably what they're referring to. So making sure that atmosphere doesn't get into the optic system. You see issues with that because, it's either a combination of things like manufacturing tolerance, consistency in manufacturing, adhesive application, curing of said, application process, or the purging process isn't done properly. The way we do things is, we design the optical system so that it withstands recoil in two-way vectors, both rearward and forward. And, we did that primarily with like the SCAR weapon system in mind. But other, heavy bolt carrier group, violently recoiling weapons are also, in mind with that. And it's not just, emitter fixation, windage and elevation fixation, and your mount and holding zero. It's also your glass, right? Because glass has mass, particularly the objective lens. It's usually on a red dot, significantly thicker than the ocular. And the last thing you want is shooting a rifle for your, your objective to fall out of the front of the, optic, and then there goes your red dot because there's nothing to reflect off of. And so, for the LP1 design specifically, we have shelves where the glass specifically sits into the 7000 series housing consistently every single time. And then, while that happens, obviously it's, the exterior of the lens is coated in said adhesive, and then it goes through a UV curing process where very quickly, solidifies the adhesive. And then, the process of purging occurs to get nitrogen into the system and atmosphere out of the system. And so, the quality and consistency of doing that is what's going to, both it comes from design and obviously QC and QA. For example, like our LP1s, they are 100% submergent tested. Every single one of them, right, goes through the high pressure submersion testing to make sure that our seals around our buttons are good, our seals around our windage and elevation dials are good, our glass is good, all that stuff. And so, what are you doing with your optical design to resist all of these factors is probably the biggest thing. So for us, it's just, the inside of the design of the housing to make sure that the glass is situated at correct angles to a point where it's, has a very limited probability of coming out with correct kind of adhesive. And then obviously the QC and QA that follows. And I think other optics companies probably implement similar protocols. That's probably it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you don't have to comment on this because I will, because it happened to me 3 times. One company in particular, who's considered, generally speaking, a high-end one, I had their glass or lenses fall out of my optics on 3 separate units. It was loophole. Happened with their. It happened with the Devo.
Yeah.
The Devo, their Freedom red dot sight, which is their lower end red dot, but still, and the micro, the Delta Point micro, the one that was supposed to be like hang off the back of the Glock and very small.
Also, they weren't even on the same weapon. They were 3 totally different.
3 separate loopholed optics, 3 separate times had lenses fall out.
That's a hard one to fix.
Literally, in fact, the micro happened to me while I was at Finished Brutality getting ready to shoot a stage. I pulled my gun out of the holster and realized that it was filled with mud because the lens had fallen out, just gone blink, and it had filled with dirt. So something's wrong with their adhesive. Yeah.
Certainly a couple other things, like, I'm just, this is all conjecture. I'm not speaking on behalf of Lupo. I have no idea how, that shit's down in their factory. But what I can tell you is, like, a lot of when we talked about the Amazon pop-up brands or whatever, a lot of them will just contract with like Southeast Asian, optical factories who will supply them with like neutral optical samples, and they'll be like, yo, that's good, put our logo on it.
Yeah.
And that's it. Right. And so, we were curious when we initially started our little, manufacturing venture. We were reselling a particular optic SKU, and that product had, I think it was like a price around $250 to $300 or something like that. And our dealer cost was just a little bit lower than that, maybe 10 or 15% lower. And we were curious because we were like, we know this is not made stateside, and so one of the guys that we reached out to, one of the trading groups out there, were like, hey, what would this cost us? Like, we know you make this particular unit. What would this cost us if we were to make it at volume in the exact same way, with the same materials, same machining process, same glass, all that stuff? And they hit us with a dollar amount that was exceedingly lower than we had expected. So we realized exactly what was going on, right? That obviously, like the pricing structure and buyer psychology and all that stuff. And so I now know, like, the optics industry, there's not a lot of actual optics innovation or manufacturing. A lot of it is just farmed out, and that's why you may see some of these weird quality control bugs, which is like, how did this even get out of your facility? And it's really because, like, it didn't get out of their facility, it came out of another facility.
Yeah,
so,
never did. They just put the little name on it. Yep.
Exactly. And so, QC QA is huge. You can farm out all of your manufacturing, but you have to make sure that you do it right when it comes in, And so it's one of those things, man. That's tough on 3 different SKUs.
Yeah.
That's hard to come back from.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. So at this point, I'm like, it's funny too, because I didn't actually care for the Devo. It wasn't, just didn't work for me. But like the little micro on a Glock is a really nice carry red dot. It's a really interesting, tiny form factor. But after I've had 3 pieces of glass fall out of 3 Leupold products, I don't trust it anymore. To be fair, their warranty was honored. They replaced it. They gave me a new one.
Good.
But I'm not going to depend on that thing anymore. It happened 3 different optics, and then I'm not going to use that on a carry gun. That seems like a bad idea, right? At that point,
It's hard to come back from that.
Yeah. So not to be particularly like mean to Leupold, but people that watch InRange know this because they've seen it. It's been on my reviews. It happened already. So it's not like I'm exposing something that hasn't already happened on the channel.
Yeah.
This guy set the heat in the office to like 81.
Yeah, dude. Let me.
And now
it's 72 and it's on auto. How dare you?
we turned it down while you weren't looking.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Proper room temperature is 68 degrees, as far as I'm concerned. So, which makes it difficult living in Arizona. So I've got the last question for you, and this one's on the technical side for sure. FMJ. In high school physics, I learned that optics would tell me that a scope must create an image plane, either virtual or real. The verbiage on this is a little interesting. Where is this plane? How does it get there? My guess is that it's between the scope and the shooter's eye, but I can't do math anymore.
Yeah, optics physics, man, is fun. When I got into this, I was like, because I was in STEM in undergrad, but you know, it's all pre-med neuro crap, and so like, there's only so much physics that you can actually learn from that, and so I had to learn a lot from the engineers, and so like revisiting all the garbage was just hated. I'll give you the general rundown. We touched on this a little before. So first of all, it depends on, at least in the world of optics, it depends on the type of optic. Let's say a traditional scope versus a prism scope. But as we discussed, your convex lens, the whole point of a convex lens is that it takes light from the outside that comes in parallel photons, right? And it refracts it in a way so that the light converges at a point. Okay. Otherwise known as the focal point or focal plane. That is where your image technically sits. And the whole point of the ocular lens is to have a focal point that aligns with that image plane so that it magnifies it to your eyeball, right? And so you can see it a little better. And so, yes, it is either a real image or a virtual image. A real image would be something that you'd see like in an optic, like in a scope, for example. And so, what you're seeing is what's going on basically as the light comes through. A virtual image is not the actual, it's what you're seeing. It's just the optic is that the image is moved around slightly, if you will, and may require some manipulation. We talked lightly about a Pechin prism, for example, and how that, is going to, play with the light in the image that comes through, flipping it to the correct orientation to your eyeball. And so, it occurs, yes, in the middle of the optic traditionally, or between the 2 lenses at the focal plane, and where you would put a reticle in like a traditional edged reticle scope. And it's where the light converges. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Something Galileo figured out a long time ago. First guy, sort of the first guy. But yeah, interesting. Pretty fascinating stuff. And then also, I mean, being that you're doing optics for firearms, does your optics interest also go out into, for example, astronomy and like reflectors and refractors and all that stuff, or is that just auxiliary stuff? Because it's always been kind of fascinating. Like scopes, like Dobbs, like what are they called? The Schmidt-Cassegrain scopes, the ones that have lenses and mirrors and prisms all together in one optic. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
It 100%, man. And even in other things like, little things like camera equipment and stuff like that, and seeing it implemented in that application. It's brilliant stuff. Learning the theory, learning the formulas, and spending time taking stupid undergrad exams is garbage. But actually seeing it implemented in real life, obviously, is a hell of a lot more fun. So I agree.
Bending light is fun. Well, that was all the questions, and I want to thank you all for taking time out and talking to the audience about this kind of cool technical topic. Is there anything else you want to talk about or promote? This is an opportunity, because I mean, I should redirect the audience over to Lead and Steel so they can check out your website and see your offerings. And like I said, we are working with a bunch of your optics, and there's going to be reviews on the channel for people, so they're going to see that as well. But anything else you'd like to talk about, or just drop on the channel while we're talking?
I want to talk about Orwake and I want to talk about the Pandora.
Go for it.
Okay, I'll try to make it as quick as possible, but I'm nerding out about a couple of things. So the LP1 is obviously continuous improvement and all that stuff. That generational changes. We're adding something to our upcoming batch of LP1s and every batch moving forward. And on that note, hopefully we'll have finally shelves restocked early summer. So for anyone who's been waiting, my apologies for the wait. But we've finally been able to scale the manufacturing, if you will. One of the constraints that we had when we first introduced the LP1 was the use of accelerometers in this circuit. And so you'll get optic designs out there that advertise things like shake awake and stuff. For those who don't know, it's a pretty basic concept. Sandwiched between your circuit and between your cell and your LED is an accelerometer that after about let's say an hour of sensing no motion, it'll temporarily shut down the reticle and cut off power to the LED to conserve battery life. And so that's why you get some of these like shiesty optics companies saying things like, oh, it'll last you like 100,000 hours. It's like, okay, what is the standard here on what brightness setting and what's the runtime exactly?
100,000 hours of it not running.
Exactly. Yeah. It doesn't run. Right. So, from that perspective, there's certainly a benefit to saving some of your runtime, especially with an LED red dot at, with a larger reticle or higher brightness settings. You're obviously consuming more power there. The current is significantly higher at the 10th setting versus the first setting. And so for us, we didn't want to put an accelerometer in the system because we know what happens to them under extensive impact testing. They almost always fail after a set amount of newtons applied to, the optical system. And so for us, it was like, we're just going to run it the way the Swedes run it and the way Aimpoint runs it. And it's just going to be constant on until the user turns it off. And that's fine and dandy if you're just running the 2 MOA dot. If you're running the 65 MOA ring with the dot, you're going to shorten your battery life by a decent amount. At our 10th like super bright setting, the one that will reflect off the front of the optic with how freaking bright it is. At constant runtime with the full reticle, it'll last you about 600 hours, which is about the same runtime as like a Neotech, right? Holographic weapon sight. And so we wanted some of the benefits of the extension of that battery life, but we didn't want to compromise the integrity of the optical system. And so what we did was we were sitting at SHOT Show at the time, and my brother came up with this brilliant idea. My brother, again, the guy who did a lot of the engineering for us, he thought of just connecting the accelerometer to the 65 MOA ring only. And by doing that, the patent application went out and everything. So fingers crossed we get it. You tell me that. What happens there, as you may surmise here, is that you get all the savings of battery life and runtime as a result of shutting off just the ring. But because the accelerometer is only tied to the ring and not the circuit of the 2 MOA dot, if anything happens to it, you always have the redundancy of the dot as soon as you square up on the gun. So you save all the battery life. You get Aimpoint-esque battery life, right? And as soon as you need that rifle, you pick it up, you get the full reticle. It comes right back on. And so that's called Orwake, and that's going to be introduced to every LP1 moving forward, May and onwards, late May and onwards or so. And that's going to be a fun little thing that we can add there, just so people kind of get best of both worlds, right, if you will. So that's coming there. The other big thing is our Pandora. Our Pandora is our pistol red dot sight. We are not fans of the current closed emitter pistol dot space. We think there's a pretty big need for a closed emitter pistol dot that has a large window, but also has significantly or at least adequate runtime out of a CR 2032. And so what we did was, we looked at some of the competitors that we have on the market, and we decided to do things a little different. Pandora being Pandora's box, mailbox, haha, right? And then, within the same Greek theme. But we decided to look at, the Aimpoint Acro as a potential competitor. And the Acro utilizes a relatively archaic zero design. If you've ever looked through an Acro, Carl, I think you'd see it's like a pretty relatively large optic sitting on top of the slide.
Yeah.
Right. When you look through it, though, you get a pretty tiny window relative to that, and that's because your windage and elevation dials are acting on something that's called an erector tube, right? And the erector tube is, basically a little toilet paper roll where an LED sits inside, as sitting in the bottom of the tray, if you will. And then the windage and elevation dials act on that tray inside of the acro to adjust your zero. The reason being is because you can't put windage and elevation dials acting directly on the diode like you would, for example, on the LP1. And so what we did is we just decided to flip the LP1 upside down and make it a little smaller. And so our red dot does not use this internal tube design. It uses a topside emitter, and the objective lens is actually curved in the opposite direction so that it can reflect the shooter's eye. And so what you get is significantly larger window space. The windage and elevation dials sit at the top of the optic, and they, act on the emitter itself. And so you eliminate that entire tube design. And so you get all the benefits of having, longer runtime by squeezing a 2032 onto the side versus like the smaller, cells that we see in some of the competition. But you obviously get the, the benefits of the larger window size there and all that other stuff. The other optic company that implemented that was Steiner with the MPS. They just kind of fell short with, the runtime and stuff like that. So, we figured let's just bridge those two together and give people, unit constructed a 7000 series. It's going to have a large window, excellent battery life. And we also added some cool things like standoffs on the front so you can rack your pistol off of barriers, serrations on the body so you can grip it a little easier, anti-glare serrations on the rear of the optic so you get less glare coming back to the shooter's face. So, little things. And we're doing it to undercut the price of the competition as well. We're, about half of the Aimpoint Acro when it launches here in about 60 days or so.
That's awesome. Yeah, neither the Acro nor the Steiner are cheap. That's for sure.
Yeah. And so hopefully we can,
I shouldn't say cheap, but low cost. They're pretty expensive optics is what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So those are the two big projects that are coming. I figured I'd use the opportunity to.
No, awesome. That sounds really cool. And I agree with you on the closed emitter thing. I've seen too many open emitter problems not to start an argument with Garrett there because you said you don't mind them, but like
my draw to blow out my belly hair. I know.
It was at Finished Brutality a couple years back. We were out there shooting, and Rudy Reyes was borrowing a rifle that had an open emitter red dot on it. And through the course of fire, it started raining and completely made it impossible for him to see anything through the optic. It was just this mess of light and blur. And even if you blew it out, because it was continuously raining, the problem continuously happened. So essentially timed out on the stage because he couldn't see his sights. So that made me go, yeah, no, I'm not into it. Not saying they don't work. In the right conditions, they're fine. And I did use a Delta Point Pro on a lot of pistols for years and didn't have a problem. But when things go wrong on an open emitter, it goes really wrong.
Yeah, for sure.
That's where getting proficient in iron still comes in handy.
Exactly.
Yeah, although even that had a problem because he tried to do that. It didn't have a QD on it. It should have. But you couldn't see through the glass even with there was enough water and crap on the lens and fogging. It's Finland. That you couldn't use the irons either. It didn't matter. It completely made the sight picture impossible.
Yeah, so my big complaint with the closed emitter, which Ahmad already touched on, is it's so much physical space, but the window is so small that having that open emitter it's quicker for me.
Yeah.
And when the Pandora releases, maybe he'll give me a discount. I can switch out to one of those.
Well, change your mind because it can have that giant pane of glass. Yeah.
100%. Yeah,
I totally get that.
Until you crack the ocular, and you're like, that's better.
Yeah.
Now it's good.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out here and doing this. Getting on here today with me and doing these cool questions and talking about optics and this deep dive on this. And we're going to see more of your products on the channel, and hopefully we'll keep this ball rolling. What I also have to thank the audience. All these questions came from Patreon and Utron supporters, which is what keep InRange alive. We don't do sponsorships. We don't do advertising. This is not a paid segment or anything. These are just viewers keeping InRange alive, and we do content that we want to do because you make it possible. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned.